On the evening of November 20th, 1995, 23 million people in Britain sat down in front of their televisions and watched Princess Diana tell the truth. Not the managed truth, not the palace-approved version, the carefully worded statement released through official channels, the smile at the correct moment during the correct engagement. The actual truth about the marriage, about Camilla, about the eating disorder, about the self-harm, about the palace's response when she asked for help, about what she wanted and who she was, and what she thought about the institution that had consumed the better part of 15 years of her life. 23 million people, in a country of 58 million, the most watched television program in British history at that point. The palace had no idea it was coming. That is the part of the story that does not get told often enough. Not the interview itself. The interview has been analysed and quoted and replayed for 30 years, but the before. The months of planning, the secrecy, the specific and extraordinary lengths Diana went to in order to speak without being stopped. The fact that she had to construct an operation of genuine complexity just to tell her own story. This is that story. To understand why the Panorama interview required secrecy, you have to understand how completely the palace controlled Diana's communication with the world. Every public statement Diana made went through channels. Her private secretary, her press secretary, the palace press office, and ultimately the advisors who served the institution rather than the person. This was not unusual. It was the standard operating procedure for members of the royal family, and it had been the standard operating procedure for generations. The royal family communicated through official channels or not at all. The idea of a member of the family speaking directly to a journalist without clearance, without review, without the opportunity for the institution to shape or suppress what was said, this was not a thing that happened. It had never happened. Diana had been trying to tell the truth for years through channels the palace controlled, and what came out of those channels was what the palace permitted to come out. When she was struggling, the palace managed the struggle. When she was unhappy, the palace managed the unhappiness. When the marriage was collapsing, the palace managed the collapse into something it could contain, an orderly separation, a controlled narrative, a version of events that protected the institution at the expense of the person inside it. She had tried the Morton book in 1992. That had been her first attempt to speak without intermediary, the secret recordings, the shoeboxes, the 2 years of answering questions alone in her sitting room while nobody knew. The book had shaken things significantly. The palace had been furious. The separation had followed, and then the palace had reasserted control in the way that institutions reassert control when they have been surprised, by tightening the systems, by making the monitoring more thorough, by ensuring that the channels through which information flowed were channels they could see. By 1995, Diana was 34 years old. The divorce had not yet been finalized. That would come in 1996. She was still technically a member of the royal family, still subject to the institutional logic, still surrounded by people whose primary loyalty was to the crown rather than to her. She wanted to speak. She understood, with the clarity of someone who had spent 15 years learning exactly what the cameras could carry and what they couldn't, that speaking on television was different from speaking through a book. A book could be dismissed as the product of a bitter woman's imagination, could be filtered through the press and argued about and managed into something ambiguous. A face on a screen was different. A person looking into a camera and speaking directly, that was something the palace could not get between. She needed to find a way to do it without the palace knowing until it was too late to stop. Martin Bashir was a reporter at the BBC's Panorama programme. He was 32 years old in 1995, not yet famous, working on investigative journalism in the way of someone who was talented and ambitious and had not yet had the story that would define him. He had been trying to reach Diana for months. Not through the official channels. He understood that official channels led to official no's, but through the network of people around her, the friends and former staff and contacts that any careful journalist cultivated when they were trying to reach someone significant. He had been persistent. He had been patient. The contact that eventually worked was through Diana's brother, Earl Spencer. Bashir had done some work for the Spencer family on a separate matter and had established a degree of trust. Earl Spencer mentioned him to Diana. Diana agreed to an initial meeting. They met in September 1995 at Kensington Palace, without announcement. Bashir came alone. He brought documents, financial records, surveillance reports, materials that he presented to Diana as evidence of the way she was being monitored by people around her. This presentation, which later became extremely controversial, and which an independent inquiry eventually found to have involved forged documents, convinced Diana that she could trust Bashir, that he was on her side in the way that very few people in her immediate world actually were. This was a manipulation. It is important to say this clearly, because what Bashir did to secure Diana's trust was not honest, and the consequences of his dishonesty in terms of what Diana believed about the people around her, the degree to which the fabricated documents deepened her existing paranoia about being surveilled, were real and damaging. She trusted him in part because he had deceived her. And yet, what she said in that interview, when she eventually gave it, was true. The deception that secured the access did not produce a false account. It produced an honest one. This is one of the many ways in which the Bashir story resists simple conclusions. She agreed to do the interview. The planning took 2 months. 2 months of meetings that were not in any diary, phone calls that were not made from any phone that could be monitored, a production that was assembled with the specific care of people who understood that discovery would mean cancellation. Bashir came to Kensington Palace several times to talk with Diana, not to film, just to talk, to understand what she wanted to say and how she wanted to say it and what the shape of the interview should be. Diana's private secretary at the time, Patrick Jepson, did not know. Her press secretary did not know. The Palace press office did not know. The BBC's own management was told with very limited notice deliberately to reduce the window in which the information could leak to the Palace or to competing newspapers. The filming happened over 2 days, November 5th and 6th, 1995, at Kensington Palace. The production team was small. The room chosen was Diana's sitting room, where she had made the Morton recordings 3 years earlier. The choice was perhaps not accidental. She knew what a sitting room could hold. She wore a simple dark suit. She had chosen her own makeup, which was heavier than usual around the eyes, a deliberate choice. She later indicated to people she trusted because she wanted her vulnerability to be visible. She wanted people to see that she had been crying, or might cry. She wanted the weight of what she was carrying to be legible on her face. She sat down across from Bashir, and the interview began. What she said in that interview has been quoted so many times, in so many contexts, that some of it has become almost ambient, phrases so familiar they have lost their original weight. But it is worth sitting with what it actually costs to say those things in that room, on camera, knowing that the footage would eventually go somewhere she could not control. She talked about the bulimia. She said it as simply as she said everything, not dramatically, not with the performed emotion of someone recounting something for effect, but with the directness of someone who had decided that plain language was the only language worth using. She said she had made herself sick several times a day. She said her husband's response had been bewilderment. She said that the eating disorder had been her body's way of telling her that something was deeply wrong, and that when your body tells you something that clearly it is usually right. She talked about the self-harm. This was the part that most shocked people at the time, because self-harm was not something that was discussed publicly in 1995, not in the way it is now, not with the understanding that it has now. She did not use the words self-harm. She said she had hurt herself. She described specific moments. She said she had not been trying to end her life. She had been trying to make something external match the enormity of what was happening internally. She said she had asked for help and had been told to pull herself together. She talked about Camilla. She said there had been 3 people in the marriage and that it had been crowded. She said this with a composure that seemed to cost her something. You could see it in the set of her jaw, the controlled stillness of her face, the slight pause before the answer. She had known this question was coming. She had decided what she was going to say. She said it. She talked about whether she could be queen. She said she didn't think she could be queen in the conventional sense. She said she thought she could be a queen in people's hearts. She said this last thing with a simplicity that made it different from the grandiose statement it might have seemed on paper. She said it as a person describing what they actually wanted, not as a person making a declaration. She wanted to be useful. She wanted to be present. She wanted to matter in a way that the institution had not allowed her to matter. She talked about what she wanted for her sons, about wanting them to be human before they were royal, about the McDonald's visits and the tube rides and the hospice visits. She described them not as parenting strategies, but as what they actually were, a mother trying to make sure her sons understood the world they lived in. And she talked about the palace. She talked about the institution with a specificity that was more devastating than any accusation could have been. Not calling people villains, not assigning blame in ways that could be dismissed as bitterness, but describing, with clinical precision, how a system operated when it prioritized its own survival over the well-being of the people inside it. She described what it felt like to be managed, what it felt like to ask for help and receive a schedule. what it felt like to be surrounded by people whose job was to protect the institution and who had decided, perhaps without fully knowing they had decided, that protecting the institution sometimes required not protecting her. She had thought very carefully about every word. The BBC informed the palace 2 weeks before the broadcast, not as a courtesy, as notification. The broadcast was happening. The palace was being told as a matter of professional protocol, not because their input was being sought. The palace's response was, by multiple accounts, shock followed immediately by the specific activity of an institution trying to limit damage. Phone calls were made. The Queen was informed. Charles was informed. Advisors who had spent years managing Diana's public image suddenly understood that the management had been bypassed completely, that the interview existed and was going to be broadcast, and that there was nothing available to stop it. There was a brief period in which the possibility of an injunction was considered. It was considered and abandoned because the legal grounds were thin and because attempting to stop it would have generated its own enormous story, the palace trying to silence Diana, which would have been at least as damaging as the interview itself. They could not stop it. The broadcast date was November 20th, 1995. The BBC scheduled it opposite Coronation Street, which was, at the time, the most watched programme in Britain, as a statement of confidence in the interview's ability to pull audience. It pulled 23 million. The palace's response in the days following the broadcast was the response of an institution that had been wounded in public and was deciding how to respond. Buckingham Palace released a statement expressing sadness. Charles's advisors worked to place stories in the press that offered context, that the marriage had been difficult for both parties, that Diana's account was one-sided, that the institution had in fact tried to support her, and that her perception of events was coloured by her own struggles. These stories found limited purchase. 23 million people had watched Diana speak. They had watched her face, heard her voice, seen the specific quality of her presence that made it impossible to dismiss what she was saying as performance. The managed counter-narrative ran into the simple fact of her sitting there, saying what she had said, looking the way she had looked. The palace made one further response which was formal and significant. The Queen wrote letters to both Charles and Diana in December 1995 recommending that they divorce. This was unusual. Royal divorces required the approval of the sovereign, but the recommendation to pursue one was typically left to the parties. The Queen making the recommendation directly was a statement. Diana had, with the Panorama interview, made the continuation of the existing arrangement impossible. The divorce was finalised in August 1996. Diana lost her HRH title, Her Royal Highness, in the settlement. This was understood by everyone involved, and by the public who followed it closely, as a deliberate diminishment, a stripping. The palace taking back something it could take back because the things Diana had said in that room could not be taken back. She was no longer Her Royal Highness. She was Diana, Princess of Wales. She said she did not care about the title. People close to her said this was not entirely true, that the removal of the title had stung in a way she hadn't fully anticipated, not because of the title itself, but because of what it communicated, that she was being reduced, that the institution, having been unable to prevent her from speaking, was now using the tools available to it to mark her as lesser. She had spoken anyway, and the speaking had mattered. Whatever the palace did with the title, it could not undo the 23 million people who had watched. What the Panorama interview did, beyond the immediate political consequences, beyond the divorce and the title and the palace's managed response, was something larger and harder to measure. It changed the conversation about mental health in Britain in ways that were not fully visible at the time, but that became visible over the years that followed. Diana had sat on national television and talked about self-harm and eating disorders and the specific texture of depression, not using clinical language, using her own language, the language of someone describing her experience from the inside, and 23 million people had listened. In 1995, these were not things that were spoken about publicly, not by public figures, not by anyone with something to lose. The culture around mental health in Britain was still largely characterized by the instinct that Diana had been fighting against in the palace, the instinct to manage, to contain, to present composure as health. She had sat in a dark suit in her sitting room and refused that instinct on camera. The effect was not immediate. These things are never immediate, but in the years that followed, the years of increasing public conversation about mental health, the years in which celebrities and public figures began speaking about their own struggles with a candor that had not previously been normal, the years in which the stigma around these conversations began, slowly and unevenly, to shift, Diana's interview was one of the moments that people pointed to. One of the moments when someone had done it first, had made it possible for others to follow, had taken something that was considered private and shameful, and had placed it in the public conversation where it could be acknowledged. William, in his own mental health advocacy years later, said his mother had given him the language for these things. He meant this literally. She had given him words, an understanding that internal experience was something to be acknowledged and spoken rather than suppressed. The Panorama interview was the public version of what she had been doing privately with her sons for years. She was not trying to be a mental health pioneer when she sat down in front of Martin Bashir. She was trying to tell the truth about her own life. But the truth about her own life was the truth that many people were living in private and had no permission to name. And when she named it, permission spread outward from that room in ways she could not have fully anticipated. Martin Bashir's conduct became the subject of an independent inquiry in 2021, 26 years after the interview. The inquiry, led by Lord Dyson, found that Bashir had used forged bank statements to secure Diana's trust, fabricated documents suggesting that her staff were being paid to spy on her. The inquiry found that the BBC had then covered up this finding when it first investigated the matter in 1996. The inquiry's conclusions were significant. William gave a statement in which he said the interview had no legitimacy, had been obtained through deceit, and that its consequences, the damage to his parents' relationship, the impact on the divorce proceedings, the isolation it may have contributed to in Diana's final years, should be laid at the door of Bashir and the BBC. Harry said the interview had played a part in his mother's death. These statements are true in certain ways and not fully true in others, and the truth requires holding several things simultaneously. Bashir deceived Diana to secure her trust. This is documented and not disputed. The forged documents were real. The manipulation was real. The interview Diana gave was her own. This is also true. She sat in that room and said what she said, and meant what she said, and nobody put words in her mouth or invented her account of her own experience. The eating disorder was real. The self-harm was real. The loneliness was real. The sense of being managed by an institution that prioritized its survival over her well-being was real. Bashir did not fabricate any of this. He created a false context that made Diana trust him enough to say it, but what she said was her own truth. The question of whether she would have said it to someone else, through different means, without Bashir, is not answerable. She had already said it once to Andrew Morton, through the recordings. She had been looking for a way to speak publicly. Whether another journalist would have found the path, whether another broadcaster would have aired it, whether the interview would have happened in some form regardless, we cannot know. What we know is what happened. She spoke. 23 million people listened. The palace could not stop it and could not undo it. The conversation about mental health in Britain shifted in some portion that cannot be precisely calculated because of what she said, and she was dead 2 years later, in a tunnel in Paris, still being followed by people who wanted photographs of her face. In the weeks before her death, in the summer of 1997, Diana was still talking about doing another interview. She had ideas about what she wanted to say next, about the landmine campaign, and about her sons, and about the kind of work she wanted to do with the visibility she still had. She talked to people around her about it in the way she talked about things she was planning, specifically, practically, with the organizational intelligence of someone who knew how to make things happen. The interview never happened. The conversation she was planning for autumn 1997 stayed in her head, unrecorded. But the one she had given in November 1995 remained in the record, in the archives, in the memory of the 23 million people who had watched it and the many millions more who had seen clips and read transcripts and heard about it from people who had been there. She had done it once. She had found a way to speak without being stopped, in a room she had chosen, in words she had chosen, looking at a camera she understood. Whatever happened before and after, the deception, the title, the tunnel, the room existed, the words existed, the face existed. 23 million people had been there. That could not be taken back.